They didn't call her by her name, not at first. In the rain-slicked alleys and cold-water flats of South Boston, they called her Auntie Angel, the Angel. In the polished, smoke-filled back rooms, where men with heavy hands and quiet voices moved money, they called her Cal's Comfort. But in the files of the Boston police, tucked away in a damp basement box marked 1947 Unsolved, she is known only as Ilara Kelleher, the woman who gave peace to the dying and became the most terrifying secret in Callan O'Malley's criminal empire. She was the angel of death who loved a mob boss, and her disappearance was the cost of confusing God's work with the devil's. Before we continue the story of Boston's lost angel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city, which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to discover what happened to the woman who held the city's deadliest secrets. 1947 smelled of wet wool and coal smoke. Boston was a city of brick and shadow, its piety scraped thin by the war and the rationing that followed. It was a city that believed in two things with equal fervor: the absolute power of the Catholic Church and the unspoken law of the neighborhood. Ilara Kelleher moved between these two worlds like a ghost. She was not a nurse, not officially. The hospitals, with their bright lights and rigid charts, made her skin crawl. She was instead a whisper, a name passed between families sitting shiva or kneeling in the pews of St. Augustine's, praying for an end to suffering. We see her first in November. The air is iron. She walks up the bowing tenement stairs on A Street, her medical bag, a worn leather satchel, tapping gently against her hip. The apartment she enters is cold. The only heat comes from the stove, where a kettle whistles a weak, thin sound. A dock worker lies on a cot in the front room. His name is Michael. He is skeletal, his skin the color of old parchment, his lungs filled with the harbor water that will eventually kill him just slower than drowning. His wife, a woman worn down to bone and nerves, nods at Ilara and retreats to the kitchen, clutching her rosary. Ilara does not speak. She opens her bag. She moves with a ritualistic calm. She washes her hands in a bowl of cold water. She lays out a clean cloth. On it, she places a small brown glass vial of laudanum, a syringe, and her own rosary, its silver cross darkened with tea garnish. She sits by the bed. Michael's eyes flutter open. They are milky with pain. "Is it time, miss?" he whispers, the words catching on the fluid in his chest. Ilara leans close. Her voice is not warm, it is still. It is the sound of an empty church. "It is time to rest, Michael," she says. "God has seen your work. He knows you are tired." She prepares the syringe. The dose is heavy, far heavier than any hospital would sanction, but she is not a hospital. She is an ending. As the drug enters his arm, she does not look away. She holds his gaze. She begins to pray, not the hurried pleas of the fearful, but the steady, rhythmic Latin of the rite of commendation. "Profici sere anima Christiana de hoc mundo." Go forth, Christian soul, from this world. Michael's breathing, which had been a ragged, terrible battle, begins to slow. The tension leaves his face. The pain recedes. She places her thumb on his forehead, tracing the sign of the cross. "Confess your sins to him," she whispers, though she knows he is already halfway gone. He is waiting. She stays until the silence in the room is absolute, until the wife's stifled sob from the kitchen is the only sound left. Ilara washes the syringe. She repacks her bag. The wife offers her a crumpled dollar bill. Ilara pushes it back gently. "Pray for his soul," she says, "and light a candle for St. Jude." She walks back out into the freezing mist. She does not feel like a savior. She does not feel like a killer. She feels, simply, like an instrument, a necessary hand, guiding a soul from a broken vessel. She walks directly to St. Augustine's, dips her fingers in the holy water and kneels in a back pew. She asks forgiveness, not for the act, but for the pride she feels in its perfect, quiet completion. She believes she is doing what the priests, with their rules and rituals, cannot. She is offering the true mercy. And across the city, in a brick fortress of respectability, the most powerful man in South Boston was praying for the same thing. Callan Cal O'Malley did not look like a mob boss. He looked like a banker or a city councilman. He wore dark, tailored suits. His hair was neatly combed, and he never, ever raised his voice. He didn't need to. Cal O'Malley's power wasn't in violence. It was in the threat of silence. He owned the unions. He owned the shipping manifests. He owned the politicians who decided where the new roads would be built, and he owned the silence of every man who worked the docks. His home in City Point was a testament to this power. Dark wood, heavy curtains, floors polished to a mirror shine. It smelled of old money and beeswax, but for 3 months it had smelled of sickness. Upstairs in the master bedroom lay the one person Callan O'Malley could not control, his mother, Eowulf. She was the matriarch of the O'Malley line, a woman who had come from Ireland with nothing and had watched her son build an empire from smuggling and fear. She was devout, ruthless, and now she was being consumed by a cancer that had hollowed her into a relic. Cal sat by her bedside every night. He listened to the priests come and go, their muttered prayers and the click of their rosaries. He listened to the doctors, specialists from Beacon Hill, who spoke in hushed tones about management and comfort, but whose eyes held no hope. He listened most of all to his mother's breathing. It was shallow, punctuated by sharp, gasping cries that she was too proud to fully release, but too weak to contain. The morphine did less and less. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own decaying body, and it was driving him mad. Control was Cal's religion. He controlled the flow of whiskey, the outcome of elections, the lives and deaths of men who crossed him. But he could not control the multiplying cells in his mother's body. He could not threaten the pain. He could not buy its silence. One evening, his cousin, a thick-necked man named Rory, who ran the numbers on the east side, leaned in close in the hallway. The house was heavy with the smell of boiled linens and rubbing alcohol. "Cal," Rory whispered, his hat in his hands, "there's a woman. They talk about her on the docks, when my Annie's mother was going from the consumption. This woman came." Cal's eyes, the color of the grey Atlantic, did not move. "A nurse?" "No." Rory looked uncomfortable. This was not the language of their world. "Not a nurse, a comfort. They say she helps when the priests can't." He hesitated. "They say she's a saint, Cal. That she eases the passage." Cal understood. He was a man who lived in the world of subtext. Eases the passage was a clean way of saying what the church called a mortal sin. He looked at his cousin. "What's her name?" "Ilara Kelleher. Get her," Cal said. The words were flat, an order. He returned to his mother's bedside. She was awake, her eyes bright with fever, her hand thin as a bird's claw gripping the crucifix around her neck. "Callan," she rasped, "it hurts. Make it stop. Pray. Pray it stops." Cal O'Malley, the man who held Boston in his fist, bowed his head. He didn't pray. He waited. He waited for the angel. Ilara arrived the next evening. The rain was heavy, turning the gas lights on the street into blurry halos. She did not knock on the front door of the grand brick house. She went, as she always did, to the back, the servants' entrance. Rory met her, looking even more nervous in this house of oppressive wealth. He led her up the back stairs, through hallways that were silent and carpeted, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air was thick and warm. She entered the bedroom. Cal O'Malley stood by the window, looking out at the dark harbour. He didn't turn. He was a presence, a block of shadow in a dark suit. Ilara ignored him. Her focus was absolute. She looked only at the woman in the bed. Eowulf O'Malley was a ruin. The cancer had eaten away her flesh, but her eyes were still sharp. They were Cal's eyes, full of judgment and pain. Ilara approached the bed. She set down her bag. She bowed her head slightly. "Mrs. O'Malley, I am Ilara." The old woman's gaze raked over her. "You are not a nurse," Alpha whispered. It wasn't a question. "No," Ilara said softly. "I am here to pray with you." Cal turned, his face unreadable. "The priests have prayed. It does nothing." Ilara met his gaze. Her eyes were as steady as his. But where his held power, hers held a frightening certainty. "They are praying for her life, Mr. O'Malley. I am here to pray for her soul's journey." A flicker of something, respect, understanding, passed through Cal's eyes. He nodded once. "Do what you must." He walked to the door. "Rory will be outside." He left, closing the heavy oak door behind him, sealing the three of them in the room. The dying matriarch, the nervous bodyguard, and the angel. Ilara spent 2 days in that room. She did not leave. She bathed Eowulf's face. She read from the Psalms. She spoke quietly of the peace that awaited, of the release from worldly pain. She sat in the chair, her hands folded, simply watching. On the third night, the breathing changed. It became a terrible, liquid sound. "Ta drowning." Oif's eyes shot open, wide with panic. She grabbed Ilara's wrist. Her grip was iron. "Please," she begged. "No more. A dear God. Make it end." Ilara looked at the old woman. This was the moment, the pivot, the threshold she was built to guard. She leaned in close, her lips brushing the woman's ear. "He hears you," Ilara whispered. "He is ready for you. Are you ready for him?" A tear rolled down Oif's hollowed cheek. She nodded. Ilara stood. She turned to Rory, who was sweating in the corner, his rosary wrapped around his thick fist. "Go," she said. Her voice was no longer soft. It was steel. "Tell Mr. O'Malley to come. It is time to say goodbye." Rory scrambled from the room. Ilara turned back to the bed. She opened her satchel. The vial, the syringe, the laudanum. She prepared the dose, her movements fluid and economical. She did not hide it. When Cal O'Malley walked back into the room, she was standing by the bedside, the syringe in her hand. He stopped. He looked at the instrument, then at his mother, then at Ilara. Oif O'Malley's breathing was a frantic rasp. "She is in agony, Mr. O'Malley," Ilara said, her voice quiet, challenging. "She has prayed for release. God has sent me to answer." Cal looked at his mother. He saw the terror in her eyes, the desperate plea. He saw the proud, strong woman who had raised him reduced to a begging, suffering animal. He could not bear it. He walked to the bed. He took his mother's hand. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "It's all right, Ma," he whispered, his voice thick. "You can rest. I'm here. You can go." He straightened up. He looked at Ilara. He didn't speak. He just nodded. Once, Ilara moved to the other side of the bed. She administered the injection. Cal held his mother's hand. Ilara placed her other hand on Oif's shoulder, and together, the mob boss and the Angel of Death stood in silence, watching as the matriarch's struggle ceased. The ragged breaths softened. They slowed. They stopped. The silence that filled the room was profound. It was heavy. Cal O'Malley stood for a long time looking at his mother's peaceful face. The lines of pain were gone. She looked for the first time in a year like herself. Finally, he let go of her hand. He turned to Ilara. She was cleaning her syringe, her face composed, as if she had just finished taking tea. "My cousin," Cal began, his voice rough. "He will compensate you." "I take no money for God's work," Ilara said, packing her bag. "Your mother was a devout woman. She earned her peace." She started for the door. Cal's voice stopped her. "Miss Kelleher." She turned. He was studying her, not as a man studies a woman, but as a general studies a new, strange weapon. "You have a strong constitution." "I have faith, Mr. O'Malley," she replied. "Faith," he repeated, the word sounding strange in his mouth. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small folded card. "If you, or your parishes, ever require anything, a donation, a problem solved, you will call this number." Ilara looked at the card but didn't take it. "I require nothing." "Everyone requires something, Miss Kelleher," Cal said. "Everyone." He placed the card on the nightstand, next to the cold, empty water glass. Ilara left the house of O'Malley, walking back into the wet Boston night. She had relieved the suffering of the city's most powerful family. She had given peace to their queen. She did not know, as she pulled her collar tight against the wind, that she had not just ended a life. She had begun a terrible partnership. An unspoken contract had been sealed in that silent, sick-filled room. Callan O'Malley had seen her faith, and he had recognized it for what it was, a power as absolute as his own, and he intended to use it. Weeks passed. Christmas came, dusting the city in a fragile layer of white that quickly turned to gray slush. Ilara continued her work. The flu was bad that year, and the cold was relentless. The old and the sick were fading fast. Ilara was busy. She moved through the tenements, a quiet rumor of mercy. She had tried to forget the house on City Point. She had tried to forget the cold, assessing gaze of Callan O'Malley. She had thrown his card into the fire at her small apartment, but she could not forget the silence that had fallen in that room, the absolute, perfect stillness she had delivered. It had felt purer somehow, more potent. One evening in late January, as she was locking the doors at the small clinic where she volunteered, a dark car pulled up to the curb. It was a black Packard, polished to a high sheen, its engine a low, powerful rumble. Rory, Cal's cousin, got out of the driver's side. He looked just as uncomfortable as he had in the O'Malley hallway. "Miss Kelleher," he said, holding his hat. "Mr. O'Malley?" "He requests a word." Ilara stiffened. "I have nothing to say to Mr. O'Malley. His mother is at peace." It's not about his mother," Rory stammered, clearly hating his errand. "It's another matter. A friend of his. He's suffering." The word hung in the cold air between them. Suffering. It was her password, her calling. "Where?" she asked, her voice tight. "He'll take you," Rory said, gesturing to the car. She got in. The inside of the Packard smelled of rich leather and cigar smoke. It was a world away from the smell of cabbage and damp wool she was used to. They drove, not toward the grand houses of Southie, but toward the docks, to a row of cold water flats overlooking the frozen harbor. The apartment was worse than the dockworkers. It was bare. A single mattress on the floor, a chair and a crate for a table. A man lay on the mattress coughing. This wasn't the rattling cough of pneumonia. It was a deep, wet, hacking cough that shook his entire body. Consumption. Cal O'Malley stood by the window, identical to how he'd stood in his mother's room, a shadow against the grey light. "Mr. O'Malley," Ilara said, her bag in her hand. "Miss Kelleher, thank you for coming." He gestured to the man on the bed. "This is Finn. He worked the books for me a long time." The man, Finn, looked at Cal with eyes full of terror. "He's sick," Cal continued, his voice monotone. "The doctors have given him weeks. He's in terrible pain." Ilara looked at Finn. He was in pain, but he was also terrified. And he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Cal. "And," Cal added, his voice dropping, "the sickness, it's making him talk. He's confused. He's been speaking to people, to the wrong people, about things he doesn't understand." Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was different. This was not a family asking for mercy. "He's suffering, Miss Kelleher," Cal said, turning to face her. His eyes were flat. "But he's also a problem. A man shouldn't have to suffer and be a problem. It's not dignified." Ilara looked from Cal to the coughing, weeping man on the mattress. Finn wasn't asking for death. He was afraid of it. He hasn't asked for release," Ilara whispered. "He's not in his right mind," Cal said smoothly. "He's delirious. He doesn't know what he wants. But I do. I want his suffering to end. I want him to find his peace." This was the test. Ilara knew it. This was the true payment for the service she had rendered his mother. She looked at Finn. He was thin, wretched. He was dying. She could see it in the blue tint of his fingernails, the hollows of his cheeks. He would be dead in a month, and that month would be hell. But he was also a witness. "I am an instrument of God's mercy," she told herself. "The circumstance does not matter. Only the suffering." She set down her bag. "Please," Finn whispered, seeing her open the satchel. "Please, Mr. O'Malley, I didn't mean—" "I won't say nothing more, I swear to God." Cal O'Malley turned his back. He faced the window again, looking out at the ice-choked water. "Ease his passage, Miss Kelleher, as you did for my mother." Ilara's hands trembled just slightly. This was not mercy, this was something else. A cleansing, a silencing. She prepared the syringe. Finn's eyes widened. He tried to push himself up, but a fit of coughing seized him, leaving him breathless and weak. Ilara approached the bed. "Hush," she said. Her voice was cold now, the stillness replaced by something hard. "Hush now, Finn. It's time to rest. It's time to be quiet." She grabbed his thin arm. He flinched, but had no strength to resist. She administered the dose. Finn's eyes, wide with terror, stared at her. He tried to speak, but the laudanum was fast. His muscles relaxed. The terror faded, replaced by a sudden, slack-jawed emptiness. Ilara began the prayer. "Proficicere anima Christiana." Cal O'Malley turned from the window. He watched her. He watched the life leave Finn's body. He watched Ilara trace the cross on the dead man's forehead. She packed her bag in silence. "You've done a good thing today, Ilara," Cal said. He used her first name. It landed like a stone. You've given a good man dignity in his final moments. The church, they wouldn't understand this. But God does. You and I, we understand. Ilara clutched her bag. She felt sick. She felt stained. I need to go to confession, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Cal smiled. It was a thin, tight expression that held no warmth. Of course you do. Rory will drive you to St. Augustine's. He opened the door for her. As she passed, he placed a hand on her shoulder. It was heavy, possessive. You are a rare woman, Ilara Kelleher, he said. A true comfort. Ilara fled the apartment. She didn't wait for Rory. She ran down the icy street, her bag bumping against her. She didn't just feel stained, she felt implicated. She had crossed a line. She had taken the problem that had resided in Cal O'Malley's world, and with her own hands she had solved it. She had performed her ritual of mercy, but this time it felt like an execution. The confessional at St. Augustine's was older than the city itself. It smelled of old dry wood, beeswax, and the faint, sweet scent of incense that had seeped into the grain. It was Ilara's sanctuary. It was the place she went to wash the smell of sickness and death from her soul. She knelt in the darkness, her face pressed against the worn screen. The small wooden slat slid open. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, she whispered, the words automatic, a desperate rhythm. How long has it been since your last confession, my child? The voice on the other side was Father Brennan, an older man weary with a face like a dried apple. He knew everyone in Southie. He knew their sins before they spoke them. 1 week, Father. And what burdens your soul? Ilara hesitated. How could she confess this? Father, I work with the sick, the dying. I provide comfort. That is God's work, Ilara. That is not a sin, Brennan said, his voice kind. He knew her. He saw her at Mass every morning, her face pale and devout in the candlelight. The comfort I provide, Father, it is an ending to their suffering. A release. The silence from the other side of the screen stretched. Father Brennan knew precisely what she meant. He had heard whispers. You speak of the sin of playing God, he said, his voice losing its warmth, sharpening. You speak of taking a life. There is no justification, Ilara. Suffering is part of God's plan. It is the crucible that purifies the soul for heaven. You are interfering. But it's pain, Father, she insisted, her voice a desperate whisper. Useless, terrible pain. God is merciful. How can it be His will for them to suffer so? I am His mercy. I am the answer to their prayers. That, Father Brennan said, and his voice was cold as the harbor ice, is the sin of hubris, my child. You are mistaking your own will for God's. You are not an angel. You are a woman, and you are committing murder. The word hit her like a physical blow. Murder. She had never used that word. She called it release, passage, peace. It was mercy, she stammered, thinking of Finn, the terror in his eyes. Was it, Ilara? Brennan's voice was sharp. He was Cal O'Malley's confessor too. He heard the sins of the Empire every Saturday. He knew how Cal's world operated. Or was it convenience? Were you easing the pain of the sick? Or were you easing the burden of the healthy? Ilara had no answer. She began to weep, silent, shaking tears in the darkness. You are walking a dark path, Brennan warned. This power you think you have, it does not come from God. It comes from the devil. He tempts us with righteousness. He whispers to us that we are special, that we are chosen to do the hard things the rest of the world is too weak for. He paused, and she could hear him breathing, a heavy, tired sound. I cannot grant you absolution for this, Ilara. Not until you repent, not until you stop. You must promise me, you must promise God. No more. I promise, she whispered. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Then for your penance, Father Brennan said, you will pray the rosary every day for a month. You will pray for humility. You will pray for the souls of those you helped, and you will stay away from the company that pulls you into this darkness. He meant Cal O'Malley. They both knew it. Ilara left the confessional. She felt hollow, scoured, but not clean. Brennan's words echoed in her. Hubris. Murder. She walked home through the darkening streets. She felt watched. The city itself felt different. The shadows seemed deeper. She saw a black Packard parked at the end of her street. It didn't move. It just sat, waiting. She realized with a lurch of fear that Father Brennan was wrong. She couldn't stop. She couldn't stay away from Cal O'Malley. She had taken his money, metaphorically. She had solved his problem. She was part of his world now. The man on her mattress was a witness. His death was a sin, but it was also a transaction. She had prayed for forgiveness, but as she unlocked her apartment door, she knew with a sinking, terrible certainty that she was not done sinning. Callan O'Malley would not let her be done. Callan O'Malley did not love Ilara Kelleher. Love, in his world, was a liability. It was a soft target, a weakness that men like him could not afford. His mother was the exception, and she was gone. What he felt for Ilara was something far more potent and far more dangerous. He felt recognition. In her, he saw a mirror of his own will. She moved through the world with a quiet, absolute certainty. She did what needed to be done, and she cloaked it in the robes of righteousness. She did not use guns or fists. She used vials and whispers. She was the spiritual arm of his physical empire. He began to court her, not with flowers or chocolates, but with displays of his power, intertwined with his perverse version of piety. He would have Rory drive her to Mass. The black Packard would wait outside her tenement, a silent armored chaperone. When she walked into St. Augustine's, the men, the thick-necked dock workers, the bookies, the union stewards, would part for her. They would nod, their eyes a mixture of fear and reverence. "Mornin', Miss Kelleher." She was Cal's angel. She was untouchable. He would invite her to dinner, not to the flashy Italian restaurants in the North End, but to a private table at Durgin Park, or a quiet curtained booth at the Parker House. These were not romantic encounters. They were audiences. He would sit across from her, drinking his whiskey, and he would talk. He talked about his mother. He talked about the burden of leadership. He talked about the sickness in the city, the greed, the weakness, the disloyalty. You cleanse the body, Ilara," he said one night, the crystal glass cool in his hand. "You take away the pain. I do the same. For the neighborhood, for our people. We both do God's work. Just in different rooms." Ilara would sit, her hands folded, sipping her water. She was terrified of this man, but she was also mesmerized. He did not see her as a monster. He did not see her as a sinner, like Father Brennan did. He saw her as a saint. He saw her hubris and called it faith. She became his confidant. He didn't have a wife. He had no mistress that anyone knew of. He had Ilara. She was his priest, his executioner, and his absolution, all rolled into one pale, quiet woman. The crew felt it. They feared her more than they feared Cal's enforcers. A beating you could recover from. A bullet was quick. But Ilara was different. She was the silence that came after the struggle. She was the final, quiet judgment. When Cal held court in the back room of his shipping office, Ilara would sometimes be there, sitting in a chair by the wall, separate from the smoke and the men, mending a sock or reading a prayer book. Her presence changed the air. Men who came in, angry, ready to argue about territory or percentages, would see her. They would see this small, plain woman, and their voices would lower. Their bravado would curdle. It was like trying to curse in a cathedral. She was Cal's moral shield, his justification. As long as the angel was in the room, their work wasn't just crime. It was order. And Ilara, fed by his respect, by his protection, by his twisted veneration, began to believe it. Father Brennan's warnings about hubris faded. The guilt from Finn's terror-filled eyes was pushed down. She was special. She was chosen. She and Cal. They were the only ones strong enough to bear the burden of the city's sins. Their devotion was a cold, shared thing. It was the intimacy of two people who had stood together in a room and watched a life end. It was a bond, sealed not with a kiss, but with a shared, mortal sin. And with that bond, the requests became easier. The line between mercy and utility didn't just blur, it vanished. It was erased by the subtle, constant pressure of Cal O'Malley's gratitude. It began slowly. An old politician, a friend of Cal's father, was in a nursing home. He had dementia. He was shouting, telling old stories. Stories from the 1920s about prohibition runs, about payoffs, about men who had disappeared. "He's suffering," Cal said to Ilara over a quiet dinner. "He doesn't know who he is. He frightens the other residents. The sisters, they can't manage him. It's a tragedy." Ilara went to the nursing home. The politician did not look like he was in pain. He looked lost, but she remembered Cal's words. "It's a tragedy." She remembered Father Brennan's words. "Are you easing the pain of the sick or the burden of the healthy?" She pushed the thought away. She was Cal's comfort. This was her work. She sat with the old man. She held his hand. She spoke to him of his wife, who had been dead for 30 years. And when he was calm, when he was smiling at a memory, she administered the peace. The nurses found him in the morning. They called it a blessing. He had passed in his sleep. Cal sent a massive bouquet of lilies to the clinic where Ilara volunteered. There was no card. There didn't need to be. The city's rot, its web of favors and secrets, began to seep into her. She was no longer just the angel of the poor and the sick. She was the angel of the inconvenient, a rival's wife. She had cancer, yes. But she also had a ledger book. She was in agony, but she was also a threat. Ilara was dispatched. The ledger book disappeared the same night the woman passed peacefully. A young dock worker. He'd been crushed by a crate. He was paralyzed, dying slowly at Boston General. He had also seen which crate it was and knew it was filled with stolen army rifles, not machine parts. He was suffering. Ilara, dressed as a nun, a disguise Cal's men procured for her, walked into the hospital. She told the floor nurse she was there to administer last rites. She carried her bag. The dock worker was dead before matins. The police ruled it a complication from his injuries. Ilara's hands began to change. They were steady when she held the syringe. Rock, steady. But when she was alone, in her apartment, they trembled. She couldn't hold a teacup without it rattling. She stopped going to Father Brennan's confessional. The lies were too heavy to speak, and the truth was too monstrous. She went to a different church in the North End, where the priest was Italian and didn't know her name. She confessed to sins of pride, of envy, small, meaningless sins. She was haunted, not by ghosts, but by faces, the terror in Finn's eyes, the confusion in the politicians, the young dock worker's resignation. She justified it. She was a soldier. She was an instrument. Cal was the general. This was a war for the soul of the city, but her work had become an addiction. The moment of stillness, the power of the threshold, the control. She who had nothing, who was a poor plain woman, she held the final power. She, not the priests, not the doctors, not even Cal, could decide when the story ended. She needed more laudanum. Her usual suppliers, the sympathetic apothecaries who believed her stories of research, were growing wary. She mentioned it to Cal. The next day, a wooden crate was delivered to her apartment. It was marked sacramental wine. Inside were not bottles. There were hundreds of vials of medical-grade morphine, enough to comfort half the city. She looked at the crate, at the neat rows of glass vials. She felt a surge of power that was so profound, so dizzying it made her sick. She was no longer an angel. She was an arsenal. Cal O'Malley's power, built on Irish loyalty and Catholic guilt, had always been at odds with the other side of the city, the North End. Where Cal's operation was built on silence, shadows, and the implied threat of shame, the Italians, led by Alberto Sforza, were different. Sforza was a man of spectacle. He loved opera, flashy cars, and public displays of generosity that were thinly veiled threats. He saw Cal's quiet, pious nature not as strength, but as a bizarre, joyless weakness. Sforza had heard the whispers about Cal's angel. At first, he'd dismissed them. Irish superstition, Catholic nonsense. But then, patterns emerged. Finn, Cal's bookie, who had been talking to Sforza's men about switching sides, died peacefully. Senator O'Brien, who had been blocking Sforza's permits for a new processing plant, passed in his sleep. The wife of one of Sforza's own captains, a woman known to have a loud mouth and a grievance against her husband, succumbed to her illness. Sforza began to pay attention. He put his men on Ilara Kelleher. They watched her. They saw the plain woman in the dull coat. They saw her go to the tenements. They saw her go to the hospitals. They saw her brought to Cal's quiet dinners in the black Packard. Sforza didn't see an angel. He saw a weapon, a secret one. He didn't fear her. He was fascinated by her. She was a psychological tool. Cal O'Malley, the man who professed to be a devout Catholic, was using a woman to commit mortal sins for him and then cloaking her in the sanctity of the church. It was, Sforza had to admit, brilliant, and it was his primary target. "You break his angel," Sforza told his lieutenants, swirling wine in a glass. "You break his shield. He doesn't think he's a sinner, this O'Malley. He thinks he's a judge. Because this woman, she's his executioner and his priest. She kills them and she forgives him for it. He didn't want Ilara dead. Death was messy. It was Cal's game. Sforza wanted her broken. He wanted to shatter the illusion. He waited for his moment. It came on a Tuesday night. Ilara had just left the clinic. She had her bag. It was full. She had a late-night visit to make. An old union steward who had voted the wrong way and who had a weak heart. Cal had called it a tragedy waiting to happen. She was walking down the narrow gas-lit street toward her apartment. The fog was thick, rolling in off the harbor, muffling the sound of the city. Two men stepped out of an alley. They were not Irish. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits, their hats pulled low. They didn't have the heavy, brawling look of Cal's men. They were thin, quiet. Ilara froze. "Miss Kelleher," one of them said. His voice had the smooth, flat accent of the North End. "You're a hard woman to find." I don't know what you mean," she said, clutching her bag. The men smiled. They didn't move toward her. They just blocked her path. "Mr. Sforza. He admires your work," the man said. "He admires the comfort you provide. So specific." Ilara's blood ran cold. "Sforza." "Finn?" the man said, taking a step closer. Ilara stepped back. "He was a friend of ours. He was suffering. You helped him." "Senator O'Brien," the second man said, his voice like gravel. "A good man, but confused. You helped him too." I don't..." "We know who you are," the first man said. He was very close now. He wasn't reaching for her. He was reaching for her bag. Ilara clutched it. "No, please." The man didn't fight her. He simply yanked the bag from her shoulder. The strap broke. The worn leather satchel fell to the wet cobblestones. Ilara cried out. The second man grabbed her, not violently, but with an iron grip on her upper arms. He held her, forcing her to watch. The first man clicked open the bag. He looked inside. He saw the vials, the syringes, the rosary. "Such faith," he said, mocking her. He turned the bag over. The contents spilled out. The glass vials shattered on the stones. The morphine, the laudanum, her peace, spread in dark, oily puddles mixing with the harbor fog. The syringes rolled into the gutter. He picked up the rosary. He dangled it in front of her face. "You pray for them, Auntie Angel." He dropped the rosary into the puddle of morphine. "Mr. Sforza, he wants you to know, we see you," the man whispered. "We see what you are. You're not an angel. You're just the help." He nodded to the second man. They released her. Ilara crumpled to her knees, staring at the wreckage of her tools, her purpose, her sin, all of it, broken and filthy in the alley. The men didn't hit her. They didn't threaten her. They just laughed. A quiet, dry laugh. They melted back into the fog. Ilara knelt on the cobblestones, trembling. It wasn't fear of violence, it was exposure. They knew the names. They knew her work. The shield was gone. The sanctity was shattered. She frantically tried to gather the broken glass, cutting her fingers. She grabbed the rosary, now sticky with the drug. She wasn't an instrument of God. She wasn't a soldier. She was a joke, a tool that could be broken. She ran. She didn't run to her apartment. She didn't run to Cal. There was only one place she could go. She ran, her hands bleeding, clutching the filthy rosary. She ran toward the dark, looming towers of St. Augustine's. She ran to the confessional. She didn't wait for Saturday. She pounded on the heavy wooden door of the rectory, her voice hysterical, demanding. A young, sleepy-eyed priest let her in, alarmed. "Father Brennan," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the stone hallway. "I need..." I need Father Brennan, now! Minutes later, she was in the church. It was dark, empty. The only light was the red sanctuary lamp, glowing like a single, watchful eye. She half fell, half knelt at the altar rail, her breath coming in sobs. Father Brennan emerged from the sacristy, pulling his robes over his nightshirt. His face was grim. He had expected this. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Ilara, what has happened? They know, she gasped, holding up her bleeding hands, the sticky rosary. They broke my bag. They said the names. Sforza. Who knows? Brennan asked, his voice sharp. The Italians. They said I wasn't an angel. They said, they know what I am. She collapsed onto the steps. The confession she had been holding back, the true confession, poured out of her. It wasn't the calm, whispered sin of the confessional booth. It was a raw, terrified scream in the house of God. Finn, she cried, rocking back and forth. His eyes, Father, he was afraid. He wasn't suffering, he was afraid. And Senator O'Brien, he was just old. He was just old. She told him everything. The requests from Cal, the politician, the rival's wife, the dock worker, the crate of morphine, the pride, the hubris, the belief that she was Cal's partner. I thought we were doing God's work, she wept. He said we were. He said we were the same. Father Brennan looked down at her, and his face was not filled with mercy. It was filled with a terrible, cold sorrow. He saw, finally, the full, grotesque shape of the sin. You did not do God's work, Ilara, he said, his voice echoing in the empty church. You did the work of a vain, cruel man. You did not cleanse souls. You disposed of problems. But the pain, my mother, she stammered, clinging to the first act. The pure one. Your mother was your first sin, the one that felt like virtue, Brennan said, his voice flat. It was the pride, Ilara, the pride of believing you knew better than God. And Callan O'Malley. He saw that pride, and he used it. He fed it. He turned your sin into his weapon. I want absolution, she begged, clutching his robes. Please, Father, forgive me. I'll stop. I swear. I'll stop. I'll go away. Father Brennan looked at the woman at his feet. He saw the full depth of the rot. He knew Cal O'Malley. He knew Alberto Sforza. He knew the city. He knew that stopping was not an option. Not for Sforza, who had shown his hand, and certainly not for Cal, who could not afford a witness as dangerous as Ilara. Absolution, he said. His voice was tired. Absolution requires penance, true penance. It is not enough to stop, Ilara. You must atone. Anything, she whispered. I'll pray. I'll go to a convent. I'll give myself up. Yes, Father Brennan said, his voice hollow. You must. You must confess. Not just to me, but to the law. Ilara's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide with terror, met his. The police? No. Father, no, Cal, he'll kill me. He'll kill you. Then he will have another sin on his soul, Brennan said, his face a mask of granite. I will not grant God's forgiveness to you while you allow this to continue. You are not just a sinner, Ilara, you are a danger. Your mercy is a plague. You must confess to the authorities. That is the only way. That is your only penance. Ilara stared at him. The church, her sanctuary, the entire reason for her life, had just condemned her. The priest was offering her not comfort, not forgiveness, but a choice, the gallows or the bottom of the harbor. She scrambled to her feet. She backed away from him, her face a mask of horrified realization. You're just like them, she whispered. You have your rules, your order. You don't care about the suffering. You don't care about my soul. You want to cleanse the problem. She saw it then. Brennan, Cal, Sforza. They were all the same, men of power, obsessed with their own rules. And she was nothing, a tool to be used or a stain to be erased. She turned. She ran from the altar. She ran from the priest. She ran out of the heavy church doors back into the fog. Father Brennan stood alone in the dark church. He watched her go. He did not call after her. He knew he had just signed her death warrant. He made the sign of the cross. "Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domine," he whispered. "Eternal rest grant unto her, O Lord." Ilara Kelleher was never seen again. The disappearance of a single plain woman from South Boston in 1947 should not have made a ripple. Women like Ilara vanished all the time. They were swallowed by the city, by poverty, by quiet desperation. But her absence was not a ripple. It was a vacuum. A sudden, terrible silence that was louder than any gunshot. Callan O'Malley's operation did not miss a beat. The Black Packard still sat outside his shipping office. The unions still paid their dues. The politicians still took his calls. But Cal changed. He attended Mass every single day, not just Sundays. He sat in the front pew, his back rigid, his eyes fixed on the altar. He never went to Father Brennan's confessional again. He took communion, but the men who knew him said he looked like a man swallowing poison. He became obsessed with comfort. He donated vast anonymous sums to the city's hospitals. He endowed a new wing at the Catholic nursing home. He paid for the funerals of dock workers, even those with no families. He was a man haunted, not by a ghost, but by an absence. He had lost his shield. He had lost his angel. And with her, he had lost his justification. He was no longer a righteous leader, a man doing God's hard work. He was just a criminal, a sinner. And Father Brennan, he watched. He watched Cal O'Malley from the altar. He saw the spiritual rot that had set in. The priest, bound by the seal of the confessional, could say nothing. He was trapped in a shared, silent knowledge with the mob boss. The two most powerful men in South Boston, one of the body, one of the soul, were bound together by the secret of the woman who had served them both and been destroyed by them. "What happened to Ilara?" the city whispered. Sforza's men in the North End bragged over cheap wine that their boss had finally pushed O'Malley too far, that he'd broken Cal's witch and had her sent to a convent in Italy, broken and mad. Cal's men, they said nothing, which in itself was an answer. They believed Cal, in a final act of mercy, had silenced her, that upon learning she had been compromised by Sforza and had run to Brennan, she had become the ultimate problem, a witness who knew every sin, every name. They believed she was wearing concrete shoes in the deepest part of the harbor, a clean ending. But Father Brennan, in the cold, dark hours before dawn, he believed something else. He believed in a third option. He believed Ilara, having run from Sforza's men, having been damned by her church and having nowhere left to turn, had walked to the end of the long pier. He believed she had looked at the cold, black water. He believed she had clutched the sticky rosary in her bleeding hands. And realizing that she was damned by the mob, damned by God, and damned by her own pride, she had administered her own final mercy. She had not been murdered. She had not been exiled. She had, quite simply, atoned. The angel of death was gone. The city kept its secrets, and Callan O'Malley, kneeling in the pew, would look at the crucifix, his eyes hollow, forever waiting for a comfort and an absolution that would never come.